It was supposed to be an ordinary day in court, a routine hearing, a few witnesses, and a case that seemed cut and dry on paper. A black man stood accused of resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and causing public disturbance. The arresting officer, a decorated white policewoman with years on the force, walked into the courtroom with full confidence. Her testimony painted a clear picture. The man had been aggressive, non-compliant, and dangerous. To many in the room, it sounded like an open and shut case. The courtroom was quiet, almost still, as she delivered her statement with a calm authority that made it hard to question her word. But sitting at the defense table, the accused man didn't say much. He didn't interrupt. He didn't protest. He just stared forward, his hands folded, his jaw clenched. Eyes filled with something that wasn't fear, but wasn't peace either. His lawyer, however, had one thing that hadn't yet been shown. A single piece of footage, video that hadn't been turned in with the initial report, footage from a nearby store's security camera that happened to catch the entire incident from start to finish. When the judge allowed the footage to be played, the room changed. The air grew heavy, people leaned in. What everyone expected to be confirmation of the officer's story was anything but, and what they saw next didn't just contradict her sworn testimony, it completely unraveled it. The man hadn't resisted, he hadn't attacked. In fact, he barely spoke at all during the entire exchange. What really happened was far from what had been described on the stand. As the footage played on, the officer's face slowly shifted from confident to pale. Whispers filled the courtroom, and even the judge seemed visibly shaken. The truth was now in plain sight, but what would happen next? Would justice finally be served, or would the badge still outweigh the truth? What followed left everyone speechless. The silence in the courtroom after the video stopped playing was louder than any words. Everyone was still processing what they had just seen. The officer, who had just moments earlier stood with full confidence, now sat frozen, her eyes darting around the room. Her earlier testimony, detailed and firm, now stood in complete contradiction to the footage. It wasn't just a small mistake, it was a completely different version of events. And at the center of it all was a man who, up until now, had been viewed as the aggressor. To understand how things had reached this point, you have to go back a few weeks. The man, named Marcus, had just left work and was walking home when he crossed paths with the officer. According to her report, Marcus was acting suspiciously and became violent when questioned. But Marcus had a very different version, one that nobody wanted to hear at first. He said he was stopped without reason, spoken to aggressively, and then forced to the ground before he even understood what was happening. His story, unfortunately, followed a pattern many had heard before, but rarely saw proven so clearly. Marcus had no prior record. He was a community volunteer, known by neighbors and co-workers as quiet and hardworking. Yet once the arrest was made and the charges were filed, his voice seemed to disappear into the system. Until now, that single piece of footage, captured by chance, gave Marcus something that many in his situation don't get: proof. But proof doesn't always guarantee justice. As the judge asked for a recess to process what had been shown, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew even more tense. People were whispering, some shaking their heads, others watching the officer closely. Would she admit to the lie? Would the court take action? Or would this, like so many other stories, get buried beneath the weight of reputation and power? What was supposed to be a simple case was now anything but, and the next move could change everything. As court resumed, the energy in the room had shifted completely. What was once a confident prosecution now sat in silence, uncertain of how to recover. The officer still hadn't spoken a word since the video had played. Her lawyer whispered urgently into her ear, but she barely responded, staring forward like the truth had stunned her as much as it did everyone else. On the other side of the room, Marcus remained quiet, but his eyes were different now. Not because the weight had been lifted, but because he knew this moment might be the start of another battle. The judge addressed the courtroom in a slow, measured tone, acknowledging the seriousness of what had just been revealed. She called for both legal teams to prepare statements on the new evidence, but it was clear from her face that the footage had shaken her too. Still, procedure had to be followed, and the outcome was far from certain. That's when a new twist emerged. A woman from the back of the courtroom stood up. She was dressed professionally, had a notepad in hand, and quietly introduced herself as an independent investigator from the city's Civilian Review Board. She had been attending the trial as part of an ongoing inquiry into misconduct cases involving the department. Suddenly, what started as a single case was growing into something larger. The court buzzed with curiosity. Whispers grew louder. Cameras outside the courthouse had started to gather. Local reporters who thought they were covering a standard criminal hearing were now racing to understand the deeper story. Was this officer involved in other cases that needed re-examining? How many testimonies had gone unchallenged? And what would happen if more video evidence started surfacing? Marcus's lawyer, sensing a shift, began preparing not just for a defense but for something bigger, a public fight for accountability. Yet, as the spotlight started to turn toward the officer, the system itself began to resist. Internal memos leaked. Rumors of deleted body cam footage started spreading. And somewhere in all that noise, the question remained: would the truth win out, or would it get buried under politics and power? The days that followed felt like a storm that wouldn't let up. News outlets were now running the story non-stop. Bodycam bombshell, some called it. The courtroom became a media circus, with crowds gathering outside holding signs, demanding justice for Marcus and an investigation into the department. Inside, the pressure was mounting. The prosecutor, who had been confident from day one, was now visibly shaken, scrambling to restructure the case without relying on the officer's testimony. But the damage was already done, and the truth was creeping into every corner of the justice system. Marcus, who had spent weeks in jail before the trial even began, was finally being seen for who he was, a man trying to protect his dignity in a system that seemed built to silence him. Yet, even with the video out in the open, it wasn't a guaranteed win. The officer had filed an amended statement, blaming her earlier version on memory confusion under stress. Her lawyer claimed the footage was being misinterpreted and argued that it didn't show the entire context of the situation. But those who had watched it knew exactly what they saw, and for Marcus, it was never just about that one moment. It was about everything that led to it. Tension reached new heights when an anonymous source leaked internal emails suggesting the department had tried to delay the release of the footage. The judge immediately called for an emergency hearing, and rumors swirled that other cases involving the same officer were quietly being reopened. It felt like the walls were closing in on a bigger truth, one that had been kept hidden for far too long. But that truth had power, and people were beginning to rally around it. As the trial pushed forward, Marcus sat surrounded by his family and supporters, but his expression stayed guarded. He knew how easily hope could slip away. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation, as both sides prepared to deliver final arguments. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. And just when it seemed like nothing else could shake the case, someone unexpected walked through the courtroom doors, someone who claimed to have proof that could change everything. The courtroom door creaked open, drawing every pair of eyes toward the back. A tall man in plain clothes stepped inside, holding a flash drive in one hand and a folder in the other. He walked with urgency, his face tight with tension. The judge, surprised by the sudden entrance, asked the man to identify himself. He calmly introduced himself as a former technician who had worked with the police department's digital evidence unit. He wasn't scheduled to testify. In fact, he hadn't been on the radar at all. But what he claimed to have in his possession could shift the entire direction of the trial. The courtroom was frozen in silence as he explained that he had been let go from his position months earlier after raising concerns about inconsistent handling of body camera footage. He claimed that on the day Marcus was arrested, the officer's body cam had, in fact, been active, and that the footage had been downloaded and flagged internally. What happened to that video after that point? According to him, it had been removed from the official system. Not corrupted, not lost, removed. The defense team exchanged quick glances before requesting to admit the flash drive as new evidence. The judge, clearly caught between caution and curiosity, called a recess to privately review the contents. In the hallway outside the courtroom, reporters hounded the man for more details. While whispers echoed about who else might have known about the missing footage, if what he said was true, it wasn't just one officer trying to cover her tracks. It was a system working behind the scenes to protect its own. Inside the courtroom, tension was near breaking point. Marcus sat completely still, eyes locked on the bench where the judge had disappeared. His lawyer gripped the table, bracing for whatever was coming next. No one knew what was on that flash drive, but if it matched the timeline, it could blow the case wide open. The judge eventually returned, face unreadable, and called the courtroom back to order. Then she paused, staring across the room at the officer. What she said next would either push the case toward justice or expose something much deeper than anyone expected. The judge took a long breath before speaking. The entire courtroom leaned in as she addressed both sides. "What I've seen on the recovered footage changes everything," she said, her voice steady but filled with weight. The room fell into a heavy silence. On the video from the flash drive, not only was Marcus seen calmly cooperating with the officer, but a second officer, barely mentioned in the original report, was visible in the background, signaling to the arresting officer with a subtle shake of the head. It was clear now that even among their own, there had been doubt about the arrest from the very beginning. The judge declared the arrest unlawful and the testimony by the officer materially misleading. Gasps echoed across the room as the prosecution dropped all charges against Marcus. He sat still for a moment, unsure if it was real, then slowly exhaled, his shoulders dropping for the first time since the trial began. His family broke into quiet tears. But just as it seemed like the story had reached its conclusion, the judge turned her attention to something no one expected. She addressed the court again, revealing that the technician's flash drive had also contained a digital folder with dates, names, and case numbers, evidence of tampered files and suspicious deletions connected to multiple cases handled by the same officer and her unit. This wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a much larger pattern. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge ordered an immediate inquiry into the department's evidence handling practices. And then came the final twist. The second officer, barely seen in the recovered footage, was quietly sitting in the back of the courtroom. He stood up and confirmed, on record, that he had been pressured not to file a full report on the incident. His voice trembled as he said it, but it landed like thunder in the room. Suddenly, the attention shifted again, not just to Marcus's case, but to every person who had stood in that same courtroom and never got the chance to be heard. The truth had come out, but it had uncovered a storm no one saw coming. After the final hearing, Marcus stepped outside the courthouse into the cool air, greeted by a crowd that had once watched him with suspicion, now clapping and cheering for him. He didn't smile right away. It was too soon for that. But there was relief in his eyes, a quiet kind of peace that only comes after fighting through something that tried to break you. The charges were gone, his name was cleared, but what happened inside that courtroom had sparked something much bigger than just one man's story. The department launched an internal investigation, and within days, multiple cases involving the same officer were reopened. The city announced a review of police evidence protocols, especially how Bodycam footage was managed. The officer who arrested Marcus was placed on leave pending formal charges, and the technician who stepped forward was offered protection as a key whistleblower. The second officer, the one who... This story, at its heart, wasn't just about a wrongful arrest or a shocking courtroom twist. It was about truth, accountability, and the courage it takes to stand up when your voice is ignored. It reminded everyone watching that justice is not just about verdicts, it's about the fight for fairness, especially when the odds are stacked against you. And while Marcus's case may have closed, the message it sent is still echoing, urging us all to pay closer attention, ask harder questions, and believe in the power of truth, even when it's nearly buried.